old man, sipping his coffee, watches over his quiet fields in South America, remembering a past life in Germany, a life long abandoned. When a mysterious stranger from Ethiopia arrives with unsettling knowledge of his past and an ominous proposal, the serene morning turns sinister. As hidden truths come to light, Johannes Schreiber realizes his past sins are catching up, and there's no outrunning the shadows that haunt him. Who is this visitor, and what deadly game is he about to be drawn into? Prepare to uncover secrets buried deep in history, where survival is anything but guaranteed. The Functionary by W.W. Stickel. It's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen. Cajassapa, Paraguay, 1968. The sun oozed up slowly from the horizon, filling the sky with brilliant shades of pink, orange, and yellow. When it inevitably pulled clear of the imaginary line separating heaven from earth, the old man lifted his coffee cup into the air and said, "To Nordrhein-Westfalen, may you always prosper, with or without me." Following a respectful pause, he took a generous sip from his cup and gazed out across the colourful cassava and sugarcane fields that surrounded his property. At present, the fields, his fields, were absent of activity, save for the occasional jackrabbit searching for an early breakfast. Soon, however, the entire countryside would be crawling with local Guarani men, conscripted to tend to his crops. Soon, but not yet. Not until he finished his morning ritual, which consisted of drinking his coffee and visualizing a different aspect of his home country, an endeavor he'd taken up in recent years after he started having difficulties recalling specific things from his past that he cherished. Things that made him who he was. When he'd confessed his troubles to his doctor, a good German expat like himself, the man had prescribed a regiment of mental exercises which he said worked well for several of his other elderly patients. This morning's exercise involved envisioning Nordrhein-Westfalen's largest city, Köln. Köln, the Köln of his formative years, before the Reich had risen to power and changed everything. Taking another sip of his coffee, he cleared his mind and dug deep into his mental recesses in search of all the memories related to his time in Köln. Being one of his most revisited places, the images were plentiful and came to him with relative ease. As he caught them into his mind's eye, the real world fell away and spectres of his beloved city began to take shape around him. The Kölner Dome, with its Gothic vaults and massive spires, Hohenzollern Bridge crossing the mighty Rhine, Severinsterburg's city gate at Chordwigplatz, the ancient Rathaus at Innenstadt. Soon enough, the entire city lay before him in patchwork detail, some parts distinct, others vague. Luxuriating in it all, the old man moved from one remembrance to the next, until at last he arrived at the vividly envisioned Schildergasse Cafe, where all those eons ago he'd first met his darling Nadia. "Ah," he said, moved by the image's clarity, "my dear Nadia." He attempted to conjure her face, and very nearly had it when a man's voice sounded behind him, cruelly destroying the reverie. "Senor Resdon," said the voice. Jared, the old man, who presently went by the name of Resdon, jerked around in his seat and glowered at the villa's rear entrance. "What is it, Manjuelo?" he snarled in Spanish. "Sorry to disturb, senor," Manjuelo replied meekly, "but you have a guest." "A guest?" Resdon fired back. "This early?" "Si, senor." Resdon peered at his servant, silently conveying the next logical question. The housekeeper shook his head. "We searched. No weapons, no communication devices. He certainly is not from Cajassapa, and he is not white. I would guess African or Haitian." "What does he want?" "To speak with you and only you, and he will say no more." Resdon rubbed his bearded chin, pondering who this unexpected caller might be. Mossad seemed unlikely. Sending in a single man, a Schwarzer at that, was not their style. They were more apt to descend on him en masse, ambush him outside his home, as they had with Eichmann 8 years prior. No, whoever this was, they weren't interested in his capture. His money or employment, perhaps, but not his capture. Very well, Resdon said, patting the wrought iron table before him. Make sure Ricardo is in place and then bring him here. Manquello nodded and went inside. Not a minute later, he returned with the visitor. The man was tall and muscular and wore a vanilla white linen suit with a matching Panama-style hat. His skin was the color of tar, and his eyes shone brightly within their dark sockets. Instead of announcing the man's name, Manquello simply extended his arm outwards, motioning for the man to enter the backyard. The Schwarzer flashed a wide, pearly smile at the servant and started across the flagstone patio towards Resdon. Reaching the table, the visitor removed his hat, revealing a cleanly shaven pate. Resdon did not rise to greet him. "Thank you for seeing me, Herr Resdon," the man said in perfect High German. He did not offer to shake hands. Surprised to hear his native language flow from the Schwarzer's lips, Resdon frowned and responded in German. "How do you know my name? And to whom am I speaking?" The visitor fetched a handkerchief from his breast pocket, and the pearly teeth reappeared. But what's in a name, Herr Resdon?" he said. "Or do you prefer Herr Schreiber in private?" The inquiry caught the old man like a knee to the groin, and the color drained from his leathery face. Out of reflex, his eyes ticked towards the butter knife on his plate, and he considered plunging it into the visitor's chest. What kept him from doing so was the realization that he was 2 decades removed from being able to reliably pull off such a maneuver. "Why would I prefer a name that is not my own?" he said instead, figuring it wise to find out more before attempting to say anything so rash. The black man dabbed the beads of sweat that had collected on his head. So early and already so hot. This suit, it's light, but with this heat perhaps I should have dressed in something more sensible, like yourself. He motioned to Resdon's simple garments, which consisted of a white short-sleeved button-up, chino trousers, and a pair of work boots, what he thought of as his Friday clothes, as he always liked to tour the fields on Fridays. On every other day of the week, he kept himself in typical business attire. Resdon measured his guest. "Listen, I have a busy day and I'm in no mood for games. State your business or leave." "Games?" his visitor said. "Word has it you're quite fond of games." Resdon glanced at the villa's second floor and saw Ricardo's outline in the far left bedroom window. Pleased, he looked back at his visitor. "Let me say this clearly so there is no misunderstanding. Get to your point or risk a bullet to the head. One of the finest riflemen in Stroessner's army is on my staff, and he has you in his sights at this very moment. One gesture from me and it's all over for you. So please, name your business." The Schwarzer's smile vanished. He flicked a glance at the villa. "Well, as you wish." He indicated the chair across from the table from Resdon. May I?" Feeling he'd regained a semblance of control, Resdon nodded. His visitor sat in the chair and placed his hat on his lap. "My name is Isaias, and I've come here to present a proposal to you." "Isaias," Resdon replied. "Any surname?" "No, just Isaias. Where I'm from, we only have the one name, and what you would call a surname relates to my tribe, which is called Melaku." "Melaku," Resdon echoed with a sour expression. "And where is that from?" "Ethiopia," Isaias replied. The old German took a beat to digest that before moving on to the more salient point. "You mentioned a proposal. What kind of proposal do you have in mind?" "The kind I imagine you will like, Herr Resdon, for it may allow you the chance to return home after all these years spent abroad." Resdon felt his composure begin to slip again, but managed to rein it in. "Well, I'm afraid you are mistaken. This is my home." "Oh, come on now, Herr Resdon. it's obvious that you are not a native of this land. You are a man displaced, forbidden from re-entering the country that has long since abandoned him. Abandoned, is that so? It is, Isaiah said, though perhaps renounced is a more fitting word. Resdon narrowed his eyes at the African, seething internally at the dark-skinned man's words, which admittedly were true. With everything that had happened since the Second Great War ended, he could never go home again. On top of this, his visitor went on, you are a man who bears a deep longing to return to the fatherland, though you know such a thing is not possible. Ridiculous, Resdon growled as he balled his hands into fists. Isaiah seemed surprised by the contradiction. Oh? Is that not what I've been seeing from you all these mornings, as you take your breakfast out here? A longing for home? Resdon didn't quite know what to say to that, other than, you've been watching me. For some time, yes, Isaiah confessed, eyeing the fields that lay beyond the villa's walls. Every morning you seem to lose yourself in what seem to be daydreams. If I had to wager a guess, I'd say what you fantasize about most, aside from the fatherland, is her. Resdon's jaw muscles went taut beneath his beard, and he sat up straight in his chair. If he'd been in possession of a pistol, he would have put a bullet between the dark man's eyes. Having no such weapon, he stood abruptly and growled. What the hell is this? Who sent you? Who do you work for? The African held up a placating hand. Please, Herr Resdon, there's no need for such theatrics. Think of me as a mere functionary, a gatherer of information. People hire me to learn what I can of other things, other people. By now it should be evident I'm adept at my function. You are a swine, Resdon replied with a scowl. A digger of filth and dirt. But to what end? Isaiah steepled his fingers together and touched them to his lips. A fair question. Rest assured I do not work for your Israeli friends, who are indeed looking for you. No, my employer in this case is of Guarani descent. A local. Are you familiar with the name Miguel Castillo? Resdon's scowl fell away. Castillo was the newest player on the Caazapa drug scene, an ambitious upstart from the northern Boquerian region, where he'd worked for the Bolivian Machi family. Many of Resdon's local contacts felt that Castillo's arrival in the area signaled Machi's intent to expand southward. So far, Castillo hadn't flexed much muscle, though it was believed this would change once he got himself firmly established. Perhaps, the old man reasoned, the Schwartz's appearance here meant Castillo had achieved that sense of establishment. I am aware of who he is, Resdon said. Excellent. Then you understand the seriousness of my being here. Resdon gripped the back of his own chair uncertainly. Yes and no. My dealings are strictly agricultural. What would Castillo want from someone like me? All in good time, Isaiah told him. For now, as an act of good faith, I'd like to share with you some of what I've uncovered. First, your name is not Karl Resdon, nor is it any of your other preferred aliases. Hermann Dietmar, Ivan Klausmann, Hans Emmerich. It is Johannes Schreiber. Do you deny this? Resdon stood, thinking for an extended length, then drew in a breath and retook his seat. Go on, he said, not bothering to answer the question, for it seemed unnecessary to do so. Very good, the man named Isaias from the Milaku tribe said, leaning forward. Now, please bear with me as I tell you a little more about you. Part 2. After a brief pause to allow the old man to gather his thoughts, the African commenced with a brief clinical account of Johannes Schreiber's first 18 years. Born April 1898 to farmers Fritz and Elsa Schreiber, you were the youngest of 4 children. One brother, Conrad, and two sisters, Juliana and Katerina. Like your parents, you were all curious, intelligent children who enjoyed school and excelled at farming. Life, as I understand it, was by no means easy, but your family managed well enough. Could even be said that you were happy. Things changed a bit, though, in 1914 when that young Serb shot Archduke Ferdinand, and resources everywhere were allocated for the war effort. As those resources dwindled, schools closed, and you spent your days entirely on the farm. Around the same time, your father was drafted into the Deutsches Heer and was sent to the Western Front. Unfortunately, he died the following autumn at Ypres. Chlorine gas, I believe. Conrad took his death particularly hard and volunteered to join the fight himself, hoping to gain some measure of vengeance. He too paid for his decision with his life, dying at Bucharest the next winter. The African paused there and arched an eyebrow. How am I doing thus far? Johannes Schreiber gazed impassively at the man as his mind raced to comprehend how a Schwarzer could have come across any of this information. It was so long ago, and he was a nobody back then. Yet the detail was astounding. "Please, go on," was all he said. Isaias nodded. With your father and brother gone, it fell to you, your mother, and your sisters to run the farm. Grief-stricken as you all were, it was a terrible struggle, and yet you managed. The African emitted a sigh and shook his head ruefully. But then tragedy struck once more, this time coming in the form of the Spanish flu. By year's end, the women had all perished, and you found yourself alone, teetering on the brink of madness. Isaias brought his handkerchief to his forehead again and dabbed the sweat away. It was at this point, I should note, that you first showed true promise. Johannes squinted at him, confused. What? You could have given in to your suffering and let the madness consume you, but you didn't. You accepted it gradually and moved on. Got the farm up and running as best you could and even hired some locals to help. Isaias dwelled on this for a moment before continuing. If only you had stayed there on the farm instead of abruptly selling it off and running away to the war. Johannes glanced down at the butter knife again, but said nothing. Oh, granted, Isaias continued. Thanks to a grenade, your time as a sniper was limited. I understand you made the most of it prior to that happening. The African reached into his pocket and withdrew a small notepad, which he quickly glanced over. The count I have is 58 dead Russians. Sound accurate? Maybe, Johannes said noncommittally. We didn't keep track. Isaias grinned. In any case, the grenade put you out of action for the rest of the war. When you finally woke up, you were back in Köln, and the Treaty of Versailles was in its final revision. You were discharged and told to go home. Unsure of what that meant anymore, you wandered for a time, working odd jobs and spending most of your free time in a drunken stupor. It was nearly your undoing. Then, at the start of 1920, something crucial happened which altered your existence. You met Nadia. Johannes softened at the mention of his wife's name, and the memory of the first time they met flashed before him. It had been raining that day. He'd been eating alone at a table at the Schildergrass Cafe. She was seated at the table next to him, also alone, and accidentally knocked her teacup onto the floor. After helping to clean it up, he bought her another. As a show of gratitude, she invited him to her table, and they wound up talking for hours. Upon parting ways, they agreed to meet the following evening, and thereafter pieces fell smoothly into place and they became inseparable. After accurately covering the gist of that first encounter, Isaias touched upon the rather providential reunion Johannes had had with a friend from the Sniper Corps, who helped him secure a decent-paying position at the Motorenfabrik Deutz factory in Köln, where he helped to build engines for ships and automobiles. 3 months later, you proposed to Nadia. She accepted, and the two of you wed at the summer's end. By then, Nadia was already pregnant with Frederick. 9 months later, the boy arrived happy and healthy, and a year after that, Julia entered the world. The African's gaze shifted briefly to the heavens, then returned to Schreiber's discerning face. For the next decade or so, you were content, happy even. Again, so much promise. Johannes's brow furrowed at the Schwartz's usage of the word promise. The second such occasion the man had used it since starting in on this bizarre narrative of his. He considered pressing for an explanation, but found himself so taken aback by the detail being recounted that he opted to remain silent, for the time being. Going into the 30s, said the African, Germany had become a sickly beast, traveling on unsteady legs. But alas, through the malaise a savior rose. Herr Hitler, with all his ideas on nationalism and his 1,000-year Reich. Johannes bridled inwardly at the sarcasm in the Schwarz's tone. The Führer had in fact saved Germany. Speak in jest, Mehrenkopf, but Hitler was Germany's savior. He was, Esaias agreed. Unless, say, you were a Jew. The Jew, Johannes said, unable to help himself, was the root of all Europe's problems. You don't know. The Jew cost us the Great War with all their subversion and backstabbing. Their corrupt business dealings and money hoarding caused the Depression. So they all had to go. Esaias edged in. Well, your Hitler certainly thought so anyway, and went to great lengths to ensure they either fled Europe or died there. The man's smile returned. Speaking of which, you had a role in this regard during the Second War, did you not? Johannes glared at the African now, the words he wanted to express clogging up his throat. To everything its reason, right? Esaias declared. In your case, I understand you believed in 1942 a Jew killed both of your children and raped your wife. The statement hit Johannes like a wrecking ball, shattering the tenuous walls he'd put up around the event. He sucked in a breath, and it came all rushing back. It had happened while he was at work. The crazed man had broken into the flat, knocked Nadia unconscious. Then he killed the kids, severing their heads like a monster, and molested Nadia. Before leaving, he stabbed her twice in the belly. Nadia survived the attack, physically at least, but it destroyed her mentally, putting her in such a state that Johannes was eventually forced to commit her to an institution. Believed, Johannes spat, fully enraged. It freaking was. The police caught him and obtained his confession, and the Gestapo rightly executed him. They allowed me to watch. What if I told you her killer was not a Jew, but instead a regular German citizen with a severe mental illness? Esaias said coldly. I'd call you a dirty fucking liar. Esaias nodded. I've been accused of such, but it's not my way, he sighed. You were at a crossroads then. There were many directions you could have gone. But what did you do? You turned to the Schutzstaffel. Because of your war injury, they were reluctant to accept you. But after learning what happened to your family, they opened their arms. They stored you at a new camp in Poland called Sobibor, where you'd worked under one commandant, Franz Strangled. This, I might point out, is where your promise was lost. You first got a taste for... Stop, Johannes shouted, his composure spent. Then, much louder, stop it. He didn't need to hear any more. He punctuated his point by slamming his hand on the table. At once Manquello appeared at the rear of the villa, Ruger in hand. Johannes waved him off, then glared at Esaias. Very well, Mehrenhopf. You've made your point. You know all about me, somehow. Now, what is it that Castillo wants with this information? What is this proposal? Esaias raised both eyebrows now. Oh, you didn't even let me get to Auschwitz, where you truly excelled. He shrugged and shifted in his seat. Ah, well, to Castillo then. What my employer wants is very simple, Herr Schreiber. He wants for you to leave Paraguay forever and sign over all land and business holdings to him. Employees, too. Johannes blinked several times in disbelief. Pardon? Yes, if you do not agree to this today, You'll be detained by Castillo's people, and the information I've gathered will go to the Mossad. If you do agree, however, you will be permitted to return to Germany with a new identity and all your money holdings. Herr Castillo is actually impressed with your former career, and is willing to grant you this favor because of it. Isaias paused. It is much to take in, so take your time. Speechless, Johannes got up from the table and wandered over to his garden, where he stared emptily at his tomatoes and bell peppers. Deep down, he supposed he'd always known this day was coming. Now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to feel. After a thorough internal debate, he came to the detestable conclusion that he had to submit to the drug dealer's will. Castillo had all the cards, and Johannes had little doubt the man would kill him or, worse, let the Israelis have him if they turned the offer down. An offer, if legitimate, that was quite generous given the circumstances. Decision made, he returned to the table. Herr Isaias, he said, you may tell your employer I accept his terms, but on one condition. Yes. I will sign everything over to Herr Castillo, but only after I am safely and anonymously returned to Germany, said Johannes, Köln in specific. The Ethiopian leaned forward. I expected as much, Herr Schreiber. The tickets are already purchased. We leave for the fatherland tomorrow afternoon. You will meet me in Masil in the morning. We'll take the train to Asuncion and fly out at 2 p.m. I will have all the documents necessary for the trip. Johannes's face fell. What do you mean, we? I will be traveling with you, of course. See you through to Köln. Herr Castillo anticipated you would not want to sign over anything while still in Paraguay, so I will go with you and bring back the papers myself. He already has the official transfer documents drawn up. Isaias got up from his chair and placed his Panama hat on his head. If it helps, and I imagine it will, I've located Nadia, and I believe it is possible that you may see her again upon your return. Johannes's breath caught in his chest. You found Nadia? Yes, she's alive and well. I take it you favor seeing her again, then? Favor was an understatement. Abandoning Nadia, while necessary for his survival, was the thing he regretted the most in his life. He'd wanted desperately to contact her over the years, but never tried because it was far too risky. If there was a chance he'd get to see her again, giving up all his holdings here was an easy sacrifice. Yes, Johannes said. Good, Isaias replied. Well, I'll leave you now so you can attend to your affairs before you leave. Be at the Masil station by 7. If you do not show, or if you arrive with others, I cannot guarantee your safety. With this, the African turned and started towards the villa. Johannes watched him leave and then returned his gaze to the Paraguayan countryside. Every manner of emotion churned within him, and a whirlwind of conflicting notions spun in his head. Germany, Köln, double cross, train station, new identity, fresh start, unmarked grave, lies, truth, forgiveness, retribution. Nadia. His poor, sweet, broken Nadia. If by some miracle he wasn't killed tomorrow, which he suspected was a real possibility, and made it to her, would she even recognize him? Would she want to see him? Would she hate him for leaving her? Feeling very strange about it all, he ambled inside and began preparing for his journey. Part 3. After rolling through Masil's ghostly streets, Johannes parked in the train station's meager lot and left the Rambler's keys under the front seat. He'd instructed Manjuelo to come for it later and keep it for himself. The housekeeper had been a loyal servant over the years. Since the villa and the fields were to be transferred to Castillo, the car was the best he could do for the man. Grabbing his 2 suitcases from the trunk, he scaled the steps to the station's platform and looked about for Isaias. The African was seated at a bench in the middle of the platform. He had no suitcase with him, just his hat and his vanilla suit. "Either you don't have so many clothes or you really like those linen suits," Johannes said as he approached the Schwarzer. "Then again," he noted, "no luggage." "I always travel light," Isaias replied, standing. Johannes set his suitcases down. He and the African were the only two on the platform. The station's office building was equally deserted. It didn't even look open. "I didn't know this station still operated." Less than it used to, I hear," Isaias said. Johannes panned the streets and shops near the station. All were empty of human activity. He didn't know whether to be glad or worried about this. He faced the Schwarzer and turned serious. "Be truthful with me. Does Castillo mean to have my life this morning?" Isaias laughed. "Your life has more purpose than that today," he said, then peered down the tracks at the large black train approaching from the south. Johannes looked too and saw that it was an older steam engine, similar to the ones that operated in Europe during the 30s and 40s. The hulking machine chugged its way up to the platform and ground to a halt with a noise like that of a dragon in its death throes. Johannes counted 10 cars in all. The engine, 2 fancy passenger cars, and 7 rickety freight cars. The freights in particular caught his interest. They drew to mind various scenes he'd witnessed long ago during his tenure in the Schulstaffen. Trains coming and going from the ghettos and the camps, transporting all that human cargo. Sometimes the cars were just as effective as the Zyklon B granules they dropped into the showers, as whole trainloads occasionally showed up with its entire cargo expired. The second passenger car's door hissed open. "Shall we then?" Isaias prompted. Johannes looked at Isaias, nodded and picked up his suitcases. There was no conductor or any other train employee waiting to greet them and take their tickets. Isaias entered the car and Johannes followed. Once inside, he set his suitcases next to the first set of seats. "This way," the African directed, heading toward the rear of the car. Johannes grabbed his luggage again and tailed closely behind the African. He expected the man to stop at each of the rows they passed, but Isaias kept going. When they got to the furthest set of seats and still didn't sit, he spoke up. "Where are we going, Herr Melaku? There are no more seats." "Wrong car," Isaias said, opening the car's rear door. "What?" Johannes said with annoyance. "There are only freights that way." Isaias stepped across the bridgeway between the two cars and opened the opposite door. "No, this is the correct one, Herr Schreiber. I am sure of it." He entered the doorway and vanished into the rectangle of black beyond. Still arguing his point, Johannes pursued the African into the darkened car. "I am not mistaken, you damn fool," he said. "This is for cargo." The door slammed shut behind him, a familiar and awful sound resonating across many years. "You're right about that," he heard Isaias whisper in the dark. "Cargo." The breath left Johannes's lungs, and the world seemed to shift on its axis. A fragrance soon began to arise in the dark, a potent medley of excrement, urine, sweat, and fear. "What is this?" Johannes called out to Isaias. "You know what it is, Johannes," the Schwarzer said, though it didn't quite sound like Isaias's voice anymore. You vermin, you tricked me." Isaias laughed. "The words you say." Somewhere in the dark, a baby started crying. "Ah," Johannes said, "so Castillo does intend to—" "Johannes," the African interrupted. "I've never met Miguel Castillo. Not yet, at least." "What? Then who do you work for? What is the purpose of this?" Johannes dropped his luggage, retreated to the door he'd just come through, and reached for the handle. His hands couldn't find it, just rough wooden slats. 2 more babies began crying. The car shuddered and the train jolted forward. Johannes patted the wall furiously, searching for the door. He went to lash out at Esaias, but all at once he realized he wasn't Johannes Schreiber anymore. Not completely. There was another consciousness in him. A man named Stefan Garlinski, a Polish Jew from the Lodz ghetto. He was on the train with his wife, Sarah, and their 2 children, Sylvia and Eva, plus Sarah's parents. Stefan's own parents were dead, shot before they even got on the train. "Oh, you had so much hope, so much promise," Esaias whispered, though it really wasn't Esaias speaking. "You've suffered much tragedy, which I do regret. But you had your chances. You had every chance to become more than you did. Every chance to become what you should have become." It occurred to Johannes that they weren't speaking German anymore. He believed from the inflections it was Yiddish. Other realizations bubbled up in his head. "What are you?" he asked the thing that had claimed to be Esaias Melaku. "What is your real name?" Names, the Esaias thing said. "I have no name, Johannes. As I told you before, I'm merely a functionary, one of many, and you are my burden. We had such hopes for you, but you failed us miserably. So here we are." Understanding came to Johannes in stark, epiphanic waves then, and he became very afraid. "I didn't fail anything. Life failed me," he protested. "I know what you are now, yes, and I know your other names." He thought quickly and drew upon what he knew. "If you are that, then shouldn't you favor me? If I'm the monster you insinuate I am, shouldn't you wish to praise me and reward me? I can be the monster again for you." The Esaias thing chuckled. "What you think I am does not exist," it whispered. "Malice is strictly a human quality." The whisper faded into nothingness, and Johannes knew his accuser was gone. Moans arose around him. The boxcar filled with people, writhing, lamenting, dying. A feeling came over him, and he was young again, 24 years old and a Jew. He and his family were headed to Auschwitz, along with the rest of these poor people. They were all going to their deaths. The weight of this revelation weakened his knees. His legs gave way and he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Johannes woke a short time later, a passenger in Stefan Garlinski's body, aware of himself and mentally patched into Garlinski's thoughts and feelings, but physically unable to influence the man's actions. "You fainted," a woman's voice said next to him. Sarah, his wife of 6 years. "Tired," Stefan said, and Johannes felt as if he had said it. They were sitting on the boxcar's dirty floor, the entire family. Other Polish Jews from Lodz were either sitting or standing around them. They had been traveling for 3 days, to a mysterious camp called Auschwitz, where hopefully they'd be used as a labor force, as they had been in Lodz. "You must be strong, Stefan," Sarah urged, taking his hand. "We all must be, as we have been and will be." Stefan ruminated at that. Since the Nazi invasion, they'd been hiding out in various locales throughout the Polish Mazovian province. For a time, they'd been ferreted away by genteel sympathizers who'd risked their necks to hide them from the SS and the turncoat Polish police. When this became too risky, they sought refuge in makeshift camps erected in the forests of Vyshkov, Plonsk, and Zabki. It was in these camps they learned of the death factories at Belzec, Sobibor, Majdanek, Chelmno, and Treblinka. Another refugee like them, Andrei, had escaped from Majdanek and told of his experiences. He'd worked in a Sonderkommando, a special unit devoted to the burning of the bodies brought to them on the beds of trucks. The victims were mostly Jews who had either been gassed or shot. It was his job to take the naked, emaciated bodies and put them in the ovens. "I was always busy," Andrei had said, angry, weeping, and ashamed. "Always. I burned my best friends. I burned my people." 3 years they'd stayed in these nomadic forest camps, making a life for themselves. But all that came to an end in early 1944 when the turncoats raided the forest and led SS straight to them. Half of the 1,000 refugees in their group had been executed on the spot for resisting, while the others were shipped off to Lodz. Lodz was a curious place, not at all what Stefan had expected. There were many Jews confined there, but most were in survival mode, getting by day to day. Work was a must to survive. Stefan and Sarah were fortunate enough to possess exploitable skills, Stefan a blacksmith and Sarah a nurse, and thus were able to find sustainable employment. Some of the other forest refugees had no such usable talent, and these were all rounded up and executed. During their brief stay in the ghetto, Stefan and Sarah learned much more about the horrors being perpetrated by their captors. A perfect example had occurred several years earlier in Lodz itself. Due to overcrowding, the Nazis had gone to the ghetto's appointed Jewish leader, the Judenaltester, Chaim Ramkowski, and demanded 20,000 children be handed over for deportation. Ramkowski, being of the mind that they should do anything to survive, asked the parents of Lodz to hand them over. Cut off the limbs to save the body, he'd beseeched. The population nearly revolted, but Ramkowski managed to induce calm and get the children, along with a number of elderly, for the SS. And off they went, each unwittingly to their deaths. Stefan was beyond glad they weren't in the ghetto then. They'd have had to kill him to take Sylvia and Eva from his hands. Well, there were other chilling tales, and rumours abounded as to what lay ahead for those who were alive. But Stefan shielded his family from these as best he could and still held out hope. With God's help, the advancing Russians would reach the ghetto soon, and everyone would get to pick up the pieces of their previous lives. As it happened, the Russians did get close in the spring of '44, but the SS proved their mettle by immediately shipping 7,000 Jews to the still-used Chelmno for liquidation. 2 weeks later, with Chelmno being dismantled due to the enemy advance, the rest of the 60,000-strong Lodz inhabitants were shipped to other camps, mainly Auschwitz. This train they were on was one of the last deportments. Ramkowski and his family had already gone on a previous deportment. Word had it, they were already dead. Part 4. As Stefan reminisced over all of this, Johannes felt every ounce of pain and distress that came with the memories. He detested the feeling, but could do nothing about it. Stefan sat up and took Sarah's hand. "I'll be strong," he said. "I promise. We'll be okay. We're going to make it, you'll see." In the dark next to him, Sarah's mother began to whine. It was a low, ebbing sound that soon rose into a full-on wail. "Jakub," she cried. "Oh, my dear Jakub." Stefan went to her, then located his father-in-law, who was sprawled on the floor. He found the man's neck and felt for a pulse. Nothing. "He's gone, Sarah," Stefan told his wife. "I'm so sorry your father is gone. His heart, I think maybe it finally gave out." Sarah wailed too, and by custom tore at her clothes. Then they all embraced. Stefan, the senior male now, gave the death blessing. "Blessed are you, Lord, our God, King of the universe, the true judge." Since they had no hope of Tahara, the preparing of the body for burial, or having a funeral, they next began reciting the Kaddish. When they were finished, they all fell into silent prayer, wishing Jakub safe passage to the afterlife. 2 hours later, the train came to a noisy stop. Stefan pushed his way to the car's sliding door and tried to look through the slats. It was night time. All he could see were dozens of bright spotlights and dozens of dark silhouettes. Among the silhouettes, there was a great commotion, rife with shouts in German and the barking of vicious dogs. "We've arrived," someone in the car said. "Auschwitz." Auschwitz. They waited 10 minutes, then the door whipped open and several SS enlisted men were standing there, yelling for them to get down. Eager to escape that stinking car, the people poured out and were gathered into a large group. Stefan kept the family together, dread roiling in his heart. As he was herded into the group, he looked back at the car and saw that at least 12 of his fellow passengers had perished during the trip, including his father-in-law. In time, their group became part of a larger procession of Jews. The SS guards, along with a group of angry men in striped garbs, Kapus, Johannes thought, ushered them along towards a gathering of SS officers, who were mostly doctors deciding which way the Jews were to go, to the left or to the right. As the line moved along, Stefan noticed that women, children, the elderly and the infirm were being sent left, and able-bodied men and some of the sturdier women were directed to the right. Johannes knew the process well. Selections. Those to the left were to be gassed immediately. Those to the right would work for the German machine until they could work no more. Either way, they were all destined for the ovens. Stefan looked ahead and saw a ghastly scene unfold. There was a boy of about 4 in the group before theirs. The boy was holding a small suitcase and an apple. One of the SS guards saw the apple and approached the child. "Little rodent," the guard said in a genial tone. "Give me that apple." The child's parents urged the boy to comply, but the boy shook his head no and tried to hide the apple in his coat. Infuriated, the guard snatched the boy by his feet and slammed him hard against the train's wheels. The child dropped limp, and his father tried to attack the guard. The guard easily subdued the malnourished man, unholstered his pistol and shot him in the face. The child's mother attacked then, and also got a bullet through her teeth. Satisfied no one else was going to attack, the guard holstered his weapon, picked up the apple and took a bite. Smirking as he chewed, he resumed his patrol. Sarah clutched her children tight and looked at Stefan. She wanted him to do something, but knew there was nothing he could do. "Stefan," she said. "I know," he replied. "It's okay. It's going to be okay. But I know. I'm thinking." All too quickly, they reached the front of the line. An SS doctor glanced Stefan over and jerked his thumb to the right. The stone-faced man then sent Sarah, Eva, Sylvia, and Sarah's mother to the left. Stefan rushed to grab hold of his wife and daughters, but was greeted by a club to the head. The blow knocked him to the ground. Distantly, he heard his women calling out to be with him, and next he knew, hands were dragging him the other way. Events moved fast after that. Registration, the buzzing of his hair, having his prisoner number tattooed on his arm, work and barracks assignment, Birkenau, Crematorium 2, Sonderkommando. Riding on a truck to the crematorium, learning he wouldn't have to wear the normal prisoner garb and get to live in better conditions than the regular prisoners. A bed with a real mattress, liquor, plenty of food. The downside being a 4-month average lifespan. It was dawn when the truck arrived at Crematorium 2. Gouts of smoke poured from the structure's chimney stacks. Out in a field next to the crematorium, smoke also rose steadily, but from a large pit instead of the chimneys. Getting out of the truck, Stefan saw that about 200 men were lined up at the edge of this burning pit, all naked and docile. A pair of SS men were tending to them, each starting on the opposite end of the line and working inwards towards each other, putting bullets in necks as they went along. As soon as they fired, they pushed or kicked the shot Jew into the pit. Not all of the victims were dead as they fell into the flames below, as evidenced by their screams. Johannes was well acquainted with the pyres. On occasion, he'd had to attend pyre duty. It had been his least favorite assignment, largely because of the stench. Observing the scene through the Jew's eyes, it wasn't just the smell he found revolting. Someone next to Stefan said, "That, my brothers, is the Sonderkommando we are replacing. That will be us in a matter of months. I think I shall attempt to drink myself to death." Someone else said, "You don't know. Maybe if we're excellent workers, they will let us live longer. Long enough for the Russians to arrive." The first man put a hand on the second man's shoulder. "Perhaps, brother, perhaps." They all wanted to believe, but in their hearts they understood they would die like the rest. 4 months, 5 months, a year. Didn't matter when or how. When they'd served their purpose, they'd be gassed and burned here too. Stefan was convinced of this, but he no longer cared. If the rumors were true and his family had perished after the selections, what was the use in living any longer? After getting settled into their new living quarters, which were more human than Stefan expected, they were immediately broken up into work details by the head of their command, a man named Maric Politish. Goods gatherers, gas chamber wards, body extractors, body transporters, crematorium processors, and oven workers. Stefan was assigned as an oven worker, charged with the same task as Andrei, the escapee from Majdanek, who died in the forest when they were captured. Work in the crematorium was grueling at best. His first 12-hour shift nearly drove him insane. There were 5 3-door ovens in Crematorium 2. The transport detail would bring the corpses in and stack them at the end of each oven line. Stefan and a co-worker would pick the bodies up and load them onto the sliding metal gurney. 3 at a time worked best, he learned. 2 smaller bodies with a larger, ideally fattier one. Human fat burned exceedingly well. They would then pour coke powder over the bodies and load them into the ovens. A half-hour later, they repeat the sequence. All day, over and over. Around noon on the 3rd day, Stefan made a frightening discovery. The faces on the corpses, usually so waxen and nondescript, began to look familiar. After the first few batches, he realized why. They were receiving gas members of the Lodz ghetto. Members that had come on the train before theirs. People he knew, some who were friends. A sallow grey fear overwhelmed him, but he continued his steady work, for it was all that he could do. 2 days later, the faces of the corpses were those of the Jews on his train. His already unsteady hands became seismic as he kept eyeing the piles of corpses being carted in. His worst fears became reality 3 hours into his shift, for it was then that he saw them. His women. Sarah, Eva, Sylvia, and stepmother Greta, their naked lifeless bodies entwined with other women's corpses. Stefan at once tackled the Sonderkommando member pushing the cart and pulled the bodies of his beloved onto the floor. He screamed at the other workers to avert their eyes and wept over the glossy-eyed ladies he loved so very much. "I'm so sorry," he cried. "Sarah, my girls, I love you. I'll join you soon, I promise." He planted soft kisses on their waxen foreheads and said a prayer to ease their passage onward. By then, the SS overseers of the crematorium had noticed the hitch in the workflow and came to investigate. Stefan looked up and saw a man named Oberscharführer Poppitz and another named Oberscharführer Schreiber standing there, grinning at him. Johannes was taken aback at the sight of his younger self and could scarcely believe the glee in his eyes at Stefan's suffering. What was worse, he actually remembered this incident. It was the first time he'd witnessed a prisoner attack an SS guard. Why Moore had never attempted revolt had long puzzled him. In fact, the overall passive nature of the Jew and their willingness to go quietly to their deaths had only served to deepen his hatred of them. But not now. In this surreal moment, he felt numb. "What's the matter?" Poppitz asked Stefan in German, which Stefan barely understood. "Why have you stopped working?" He kicked Sarah's dead foot. "Ah, I see. Do you know these dirty whores? This one here looked like a good fuck in her day. Maybe she still is." Beside him, the young Oberscharführer Schreiber tittered softly. Stefan, propelled into insanity by the Nazi's words, vaulted to his oven, snatched the long poker he used to push the corpses into the flames, and came at Poppitz like a rabid animal. The poker struck Poppitz in the chest, but Stefan was too weak to drive it home. The officer deflected the pointed end so that it jabbed into his shoulder instead, and shouted a furious lament. At his side, Schreiber drew his pistol and aimed it at Stefan's head. Stefan looked his killer in the eye and welcomed the bullet's arrival. Johannes looked himself in the eye and felt revulsion break through the numbness. There was a flash from the end of the pistol, a brief instance of pain, then everything went black again. Stefan Garlinski was no more. Johannes, however, remained in the darkness, alive and reeling. An unknown time passed, and then a voice spoke, It was the Esaias thing, in the dark with him. A different perspective, yes. Yes, Johannes cried. It was. And your impression? I understand now, Johannes said. Your point, it is made. No, Johannes, it is not. The Esaias thing told him. And you do not yet understand. That was but one life you took. A mere glimpse. It has been determined you were responsible for 62,118 more between Auschwitz and Sobibor. This is how many more tickets you have. Oh, please, no, Johannes said. This is enough, please. Perhaps a gypsy girl this time. A twin for Mengeler's experiments. How does that sound? Johannes could already feel himself taking shape again, his essence being drawn into another human, this one younger than the last, with a bony frame and female parts. The name of the girl was Mirella Simsa, a barely pubescent Roma gypsy from Hungary on her way to Auschwitz. She and her twin sister Layla had been captured along with their mother and father, and hundreds of other Romas near Budapest. Reviled as much as the Jews, they had been confined to a small camp for a couple of days before being forced on this train. Johannes somehow remembered the two girls. He'd been walking from the crematorium early one evening after his shift, on his way to the main camp to speak with administrative officials. Still new to the grounds at this point, he'd accidentally wandered by the Zigeunerlager, where all the gypsies were collected. As he walked past, he noticed the two pretty girls standing by the fence. Recalling that the camp doctor had been involved in experiments with twins, he made a mental note of them in case they'd been overlooked. The next time he'd seen the doctor, he'd mentioned them. Afterward, he thought nothing of the girls. But they were going to die anyway. Why is it my responsibility? Johannes thought. Because they had been overlooked, the Esaias thing replied, and the doctor did find a good use for them. Johannes was inclined to protest, but suspected it didn't matter. Yes, Johannes, the Esaias thing said. No more arguing. Johannes thought and said no more. If he could have cried, he would have. And with a jolt, the train lurched forward. Well, some stories you just know that you just have to read. It's never an easy subject matter, but that was excellently written, and I think the ending made it worth it. Come up and say. Oh, well, that was quite an emotional one to read. So I'm not going to say too much at the end here. I think you can probably all understand why. Anyway, thank you to the author of that one. It's really well written, and it was I can't say it was a joy to read, but it was something that I felt I needed to, and I hope you are feeling the same. Well, okay, that's enough for this evening. I'll be back again tomorrow night with something different. Okay? Till then, my dear friends, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.